This is Elsa. I'm going to get the ball rolling, and then Meredith and I will be tag teaming during our portion of the webinar. So thanks to everybody who answered the poll. It seems like most of us, like Charlotte said, are interested in making a bee hotel for personal use or already have one. And that's consistent with kind of what we've been hearing informally throughout the past year or two. We've been getting a lot of questions about how to make a bee hotel, how to keep it healthy. And so we've put together some background and some advice that should help you to not just make one, but to do it well, and one that will be occupied and produce lots of bee offspring. For those of you who are new to the idea of bee hotels, oh boy, I realized, how do I actually advance my slides when I'm sharing the screen? That's something we didn't test. Charlotte, Matt?
You should be able to just press the arrow keys and
yeah,
it should
that's
work.
not doing anything.
What if you click your mouse, like just do a left click? There you go.
Okay, the mouse wheel seems to do it. Okay, so sorry about that. So for those of you who are just curious or new to the idea of bee hotels, briefly, a bee hotel is basically a nest box for bees, kind of comparable to putting a birdhouse in your yard. And the purpose of it is to simulate habitat that may be missing in urban or agricultural environments where we've cleared away, dead plants, perennial, last year's stems, dead wood. Those are the habitats that these bees would normally use, and we can replace those by putting these sort of artificial or constructed nesting blocks. You could do this with various goals. They can be used to augment pollination services in a garden or an agricultural setting. You might do it just for conservation purposes to provide habitat where it's otherwise missing. It can also just be fun to watch your residents going in and out of a bee hotel. There are also citizen science research opportunities that ask you to specifically observe these and report information back. So there's lots of reasons to make one. There's a bewildering array of sort of shapes and sizes and designs that you may encounter, and these are all examples of sort of different versions of bee hotels. Some recommended more than others, and toward the end, we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of those design considerations. But first, I'd like to actually step back and give us some background on bee diversity and biology in North Carolina, so you have some context for what slice of diversity is actually going to occupy a bee hotel. And then we'll look at some of the specific residents that are likely to move in, and then some of the considerations for materials and design, placement, and maintenance of a bee hotel. So to start off with diversity, bees are a tremendously diverse group of insects. These pictures show some of the varied sizes and colors of bees. It definitely goes beyond the classic search image of the black and yellow bumblebee or honeybee. We have everything on this screen is a bee, even though some of them might look much more like wasps. In North Carolina, our diversity is well over 500 species of bees recorded in the state. We're actually close to 600 at latest count. In the Triangle area alone, we're well over 100 species. I've logged more than 70 in my yard. That's a small slice of the continental diversity, which is about 4,000 species in North America and 20,000 species in the world. So it's hard to generalize about bees given all this diversity, but there are some things that they all have in common. Even, everything from this, big fuzzy carpenter bee to this very waspy looking little cuckoo bee. And here I am going to launch our next poll. Let's see, or no, first I'm going to go to the next screen, then I'm going to launch our poll. Okay, I again might need some, oh, here we go. So this is a multiple choice question. You can pick multiple answers. So the answers are A, so these are the things that, if you have an insect in front of you and you're not sure if it's a bee or a wasp, which piece of information here would actually tell you the difference? Would you need to know that A, the animal can pollinate and therefore it's a bee, or B, only bees have branched hairs on their bodies and therefore not a wasp, bees have narrower waists than wasps, or only bees feed pollen to their larvae? So I'll give you another 20, 30 seconds. We'll see how the answers come in to consider these options and mark off whichever ones you think would separate bees from wasps. So we're up to about 100 answers. I'll give us a few a little bit longer.
You guys, I see some people are saying they can't see the answers, but I hope if you see the poll, it says A, B, C, D, and then the answers that correspond to that are on the slide itself. And if the poll is blocking those answers on the slide, you can pick up that box, that poll box, and move it around the screen.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. All right, so we've got a good number of replies here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the polling and share that with you. Let's see, share results. And you guys, you're good. Nobody was tricked. Very few of you were tricked by the possibility that only bees pollinate, which is not accurate. A variety of insects, bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, all do some pollinating. It's true that bees are among the most efficient. In one visit to a flower, they do more pollinating than most other insects, but there are lots of others out there who do it. The branched hair answer was the top polling answer. 58% of you picked that, and that is accurate. If you've got a microscope or magnification, that is the one for sure tell that bees will have branched hairs and wasps will not. And that's related to the other correct answer, D, that bees feed pollen to their larvae, whereas wasps, almost all wasps do not. The wasps that closely resemble bees are actually hunters. They mostly collect things like caterpillars, spiders, or crickets to feed to their larvae. Bees are just sort of vegetarian wasps who've traded that hunting lifestyle for pollen as their protein source instead of meat. So this slide then shows the correct answers, which we already talked through. And to give you a sense of how that looks, this is a magnified image of some of those branched hairs on a bee's body, and that's related to the pollen collecting life cycle. It helps them hold more pollen on their bodies, which the purpose of that is to then be able to take it back to their nest and form it into a pollen ball or some sort of concentrated provision that they'll lay an egg on, and then their larva, continuing the life cycle, will eat that pollen ball, mature into a pupa, emerge in an adult, and then resume the whole cycle, starting with foraging at flowers, which is where we normally see them. But that's only sort of half the habitat requirement of a bee. It also has to have a place to nest. And this is an example of one sort of bee nest where they're actually taking all the pollen they're collecting at flowers and continuing through the cycle. So bees share this basic life cycle. There are lots of variations, and we're not going to talk about all of them today. Some of those variations involve social organization. Bees may be social, like honeybees, or the majority are solitary, every bee for herself. They may vary in diet. Some have very particular plants that they will feed from, while others visit a great variety of flowers. And then what concerns us today is variation in nesting location. And for the majority of bees, here in the eastern US, 70 to 80% actually nest in the ground. So this group of bees is not going to be interested in a bee hotel at all. They build their own tunnels in the earth, and within them, will store their pollen provisions, lay their eggs, and so on. So this is most bees. Bumblebees are also kind of their own funny nesting category. They also won't show up in a bee hotel. Instead, they use larger pre-existing spaces. They like to nest where other things have nested before. So you'll often find them in old rodent burrows, in mouse nests that may be tucked under grass tussocks, that kind of thing, or in a corner of a shed or in some insulation in the attic. The most common place people actually encounter them is in old birdhouses that haven't been cleaned out. There's one species here, our brown-belted bumblebee, that likes to nest in birdhouses using old bird nests. So that leaves us about 20 to 30% of the bee diversity here in North Carolina is actually interested in these kinds of above ground cavity nests like we might provide using a bee hotel. So the original nesting substrates of these species might be beetle holes in dead wood. They might be pithy stems that the bees hollow out. Even our carpenter bees, which usually insist on drilling their own holes, will sometimes occupy larger holes within a wooden block bee hotel. And we'll continue and look at some of the more common species. So obviously we're not going to go through every option for 20 to 30% of the bee species when we have almost 600 species in the state, but we'll look at some of the common residents and groups of residents that you're likely to attract if you do put a bee hotel out. One of the most sought after groups are these Osmia mason bees. They tend to be active in the spring, sort of April is peak, but sort of March through June you can find them. The most famous one of these is Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard bee, also known as the orchard mason bee. That's a species that's actually commercially managed for pollination in orchards, and you can purchase cocoons to release in your own yard. In general, you don't need to purchase them unless you are doing a large-scale operation. Otherwise, if you just put out like a small bee hotel, the local residents will come occupy it, and you don't need to add bees to the system. Besides the one famous Osmia, there's another 21 species in North Carolina that vary in size. So as a genus, this group of mason bees will occupy nest holes that have a diameter of 5 to 8 millimeters. And besides the nest hole itself, they do need additional construction materials to sort of remodel the interior of the nest. And depending on the species, that may be mud or leaves that they sort of chew up into a pulp. And this image down at the bottom shows a cross-section of a nest. This is a nest that was made in a hollow reed, and it's been split open so you can see what was going on inside. So this is the closed end with the internode on the back here on the left. On the right is the open end, so that's where the mother bee would enter. She starts her nest by going all the way to the back and builds a partition, in this case out of sort of a chewed up leaf material. Then she builds a pollen provision, and then lays an egg on it, and then builds another partition and proceeds just sort of packing that nest tube until it's pretty much full. She puts males in the back, puts females in the back. She knows what sex of egg she's laying, depending on whether she fertilizes or not. Fertilized egg is a female, unfertilized egg is a male. So she puts females in the back, kind of the safest part of the nest, the males in the front. And I actually, in the chat earlier, I put a link to a video if you ever want to check out sort of video of mason and leafcutter bees constructing the inside of the nest. There's some beautiful footage of it, which I'm not going to show during our webinar today. So that's what's going on in there. They need the mud or leaves to make these partitions. And then of course they need a source of forage, which for Osmia, they often will collect pollen from redbud, fruit trees, clover, cane fruits, and so on. Another common group that will occupy these is megachile or leaf cutting bees. They tend to be active later into the summer. And of these, there are 37 species found in North Carolina, of which some are introduced, and probably the famous one, the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, that one is among the introduced species. And it's also commercially managed for alfalfa pollination and canola. It's another one that you can purchase, but probably don't really need to. As a genus, this group will use holes that are 5 to 8 millimeters in diameter, and also needs construction materials for the inside of the nest. Some use resin, most use leaves. And here is an example, like you will know you have these bees around if you have plants with these neat circles cut out of the leaves. And that's what the mother bees are cutting out and taking back into their nest to build these little chambers within the nest. And so each of these little leaf cigars would be full of pollen and an egg. And some of the common plants that are used by leaf-cutting bees that you might want to have around and available if you're trying to attract these species to a bee hotel include roses, redbuds, grapes, greenbrier, smilax, or buckwheat or honeysuckle. They're not particularly specialist or picky, but these are some of the favorites. They won't use just any plant. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
So, and Elsa, I see them a lot on redbud and wild grape, even sometimes blueberries.
Wow.
And, you know, just thinking about the plants you've listed, I wonder if it's a texture thing. So they're going for leaves that aren't too thick, you know, like a real thick evergreen leaf, I guess.
Right.
I don't know if there's been any studies on like the leaf preferences or what.
I mean, these this list comes, and there is a bigger list that comes from people having opened up the nests and actually DNA barcoded the plants to see like, hey, what were they actually using? I don't think we have data that say like what are the strongest preferences, but these are some of the ones that most often turn up in their nests. But yeah, I agree. They tend to be kind of not super thick, flexible, smooth sorts of leaves. So there may be something to that, but I don't think we have really the data to say that for sure yet.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another group that's worth mentioning are the small carpenter bees. These are the closest cousins of our large carpenter bees that drill holes in our decks and siding. These little bees are about the size of a grain of rice. They're much smaller, and they don't drill into sound wood. Instead, they nest in hollow stems, pithy stems, so things like blackberries or old perennial stems, sumac, and so on. The stem needs to be broken for them to have access to the inside, and it has to have the pith still in it because these bees use the pith as the material to make those chambers inside the nest. So for most traditional bee hotels where we're just providing a drilled piece of wood or a hollow reed or bamboo, they won't use that because there's no pith there. But if you're interested in attracting this group of bees, which is active all year long, has kind of a cool life history with a little bit of parental care that most solitary bees don't have, you might try adding some extra materials into your bee hotel that do contain pithy stems. All right, so those are a few of the residents I wanted to highlight, and now I will hand it over to Meredith to talk about some of the non-bees who may turn up in your nests.
Excellent, thanks Elsa. Hi everybody, this is Meredith, and I'm gonna share my screen now so we can talk about the wasps a little bit that'll be using our bee hotels as well. Okay. Can everyone see my screen arrow? Good to go?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, everybody. All right, so Elsa just gave us a nice snapshot of the different bees that we can see in our area that are using bee hotels, and there's a wide variety of them. As we can see, that also applies for the wasps. So there's a ton of these around, and today we're going to touch on a few of them, and they're actually really great residents to have in your hotels as well. So here we go. So the wasp residents that we'll see in our bee hotels in this area, they come in all different shapes and sizes, just like our native bees. And the most common ones that we will see visiting are our mason and potter wasps, thread waist wasps, as well as square-headed wasps. And what's interesting is bees, especially the osmia species, typically show up a little bit earlier in the year, starting in the spring. And then as it starts to get into a little bit later spring, into the summer, we start to see the wasps really show up and become pretty frequent in our bee hotels and things. And so to kick off the wasp section, I have another poll for everybody to do. And let's see if I can get that started. This is a 2-question poll. And we just want to know what you think if the wasps that are using your bee hotels are social or solitary. So I've just launched it. And results are coming in. Nice and hot, wow. Already got over 100. This is a quick one. We're getting close. I'm going to give you guys a few more seconds to finish up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end and share the results. And so we have a winner for solitary. Great work, everybody. Yes, the wasps that are using your bee hotels are in fact solitary. They are different than the social wasps that we often think of first thing, like our paper wasps and our yellow jackets. The wasps that are using bee hotels are solitary. So great work. There's our answer. So a little bit on our cavity nesting wasps. So as we just learned, all of our wasps that use the bee hotels are solitary, and they are not as aggressive as social wasps. So they are not actively defending their nests as you would think. Yellow jackets, especially, paper wasps as well. So when you have them using your bee hotel in your yard, it's absolutely fine to be out in your garden working close to your bee hotels if you see a wasp using it. that's completely fine. They are not as aggressive. They will really only sting if you step on them accidentally. Most have 2 or more generations per year and will overwinter, so be in their little cavities as larvae. They undergo this state called diapause. It's essentially they suspend development for a while until the weather becomes warm again and their development starts again. And so they will become pupa and then adults, and then they will emerge and nest for a couple generations and then continue into the next year with that same kind of cycle, overwintering as little larvae. And what's different about our wasp larvae compared to bee larvae is that they need arthropods or prey items to feed on. So these include crickets, caterpillars, spiders. And so the adult wasp will go out and hunt for these different arthropods, will paralyze them, bring them back to the nest, and stow them away in the cavities for their larvae to munch on and develop. And like bees, female wasps also have this cool trick where they're able to use fertilization essentially to determine the egg sex that they're going to be putting in their nest. So they put their females in the back that take a longer time to develop in the innermost cells, and they will lay male eggs towards the front. So everyone comes out around the same time essentially and doesn't step on each other trying to exit the cavity when everyone's an adult and ready to go out and forage. So it's a cool trick. What's also interesting when you're looking at your bee hotel is if you're curious to know whether a wasp is using it or a bee, is you can often look at the cap, which is the front of your cavity, as well as a cross view. If you're doing like a study, you can actually take an X-ray image and cross section and use different characteristics of those different cavities to tell who's using your bee hotel. So the picture on the side with the different caps, this is from the USDA. This is a nice resource for being able to detect Osmia lignaria, which is our blue orchard bee that Elsa talked about, that's really gaining a lot of prominence as an alternative to honeybees for pollinating, especially in orchards. They make more of a lumpy kind of mud-shaped cap. Wasps are in the top middle. They make more of a smoothed cap out of mud and sand for the most part. And then on the top right, we have a megachile bee, our leaf cutter bee, that uses bits of leaf pulp and things, sand. So, and then there's also other different types of Osmia species, the mason bees at the bottom, that use different types of materials too. So you can actually tell from the front door a lot of times who's using the cavity. On the right-hand side is from a study in our area from South Carolina and Georgia, where they were trying to detect the different types of bees and wasps that they were using hotels around. And up at the top, you can actually see it's a little grainy, but the little squiggles that are in between each of the partitions, those are actually caterpillars. So that helps us know those are wasps. So this is actually a mason wasp using this particular cavity. Below that, we have two little prepupa. That's a grass-carrying wasp, and you can tell based on the pupil morphology. Once you study them enough, you can actually tell them apart. The next two are bee tunnels, bee cavities, because they have pollen provisions. The one at the bottom actually has pebbles towards the front. That's the front of the cavity is actually on our far right side. So that particular species of Osmia actually uses pebbles, so you can tell them apart. Working our way down, we have a wasp below that also uses pebbles. This is a small thread-waisted wasp. And then below that, two square-headed wasp cavities. And at the bottom, we have a carpenter bee cavity with pupae actually in each partition. And Elsa has taken a really nice picture as a nice visual for us to look at. It's at the low bottom on the left of what the carpenter bee pupae actually look like in real life if you cut it open. And so now we're gonna meet a little bit of variety of the different wasps will be using your bee hotels. Again, there's a lot of different varieties, but these are a good representation of the ones that you will most often see using your bee hotel in our area. Our first group is the Vespidae wasp. These are the same. This is the family that also includes yellow jackets and paper wasps, but also includes these potter and mason wasps that are solitary. Some of these species actually make nests out of mud. They're simple pots and vases, and that's how they get their name. The species that use our bee hotels are using cavities in wood. Often they were beetle borings before. And so this is a variety of the different potter and mason wasps that we'll see. We have a Uodenaris megra, is a nice big black and yellow wasp. Manobia quadridens is the biggest of the Vespid wasps you'll see visiting your bee hotel. They like to use old carpenter bee homes. I also have Simorphus, which is a smaller type of Vespid wasp, uses very small diameter holes. That uses a 3.2 millimeter, while in contrast, Manobia quadridens uses the biggest size, like 12.7 millimeter. Pathogenaris arenis is our red and black mason wasp. This is the only red marked type of wasp of this genus in our area, of the species in our area. So if you see it, it's most often the species. And then we also have some Ancestrosirus wasps that have been known to use elder and sumac stems as well for their nesting material. Moving on to our next group, we have thread waist wasps. They get their name because some of these species have a very exaggerated, what we call pedestal. This is the connection between the thorax and the abdomen. And so it looks like they have a very thread-like waist. So that's how they get their name. Often these wasps are very slender in appearance, black or a metallic blue with some bright markings. We're going to focus on the Isodontia genus today mostly. These are what we call the grass-carrying wasps, and they get their name because females can be seen flying around the yard or your yards with blades of grass in their mouths, and that's what they use to actually make their partitions and cap their tunnels in bee hotels. And they also been known to nest in the tracks of storm doors and windows. So if you see these little tufts of grass in the tracks of your doors, that might be an Isodontia pupae. You can simply remove them. The females don't actively defend their nests, and so it's completely fine if you see those, just remove them. Another type of small thread waist wasp that you can see visiting in our area is Soliarella planiculoides. This particular wasp, actually these wasps in particular, like grasshoppers, this one actually will go after seed bugs too. It likes to line its nest with pebbles and different twigs and things. And these wasps are active in April to August. I forgot to mention earlier, the Vespids are also active in the summer months, May to August, and they are in fact, I'll slide back a little bit. The Vespid wasps are in fact caterpillar predators. That's a big thing that's really interesting about these guys. They provide a great pest control in your yard. They will go after different leaf miners, or leaf rolling caterpillars and leaf tear caterpillars. So they provide a nice pest control service for you as well. So these are caterpillar specialists, while our thread waist wasp more go after crickets and grasshoppers. And our last group of wasps, these are the square-headed wasps in the Tropoxylon genus. These are spider predators. So you can actually see up at the top left, there's a picture of a square-headed wasp taking a spider home for its larva to munch on. And these wasps are out more June to August. They get their name because they kind of have a square-like head, but also they're known as keyhole wasps. And this is because they like to use beetle burrows as well as their cavities. And so they really like our bee hotels as well. The most well-known species in this group is the organ pipe mud dauber, but in fact, this species is a little different from the rest because it's the only species of this group that actually makes these elaborate mud-like tubes for its home. The rest use cavities such as in rotten wood in our bee hotels. And so if wasps are using your bee hotel, this is actually a great thing. Again, these are solitary wasps. They're not social. They're not going to aggressively be territorial in defending their nests. So they're great to have around. They also pollinate, just like Elsa mentioned earlier, not just bees, but wasps, flies, other insects pollinate. The adults of wasps feed mostly on nectar and pollen and sugars and carbohydrates. So they are great to have around. They'll visit the flowers as well as provide some pest control in your yard for feeding their young, grabbing those caterpillars and other arthropods. So it's great to make everyone feel at home in your hotel by providing a lot of different size holes to promote different wasps and bees to visit in your hotel. And we'll touch on that a little bit more as we're talking about making your own bee hotel. So now we're going to switch gears into actually talking about the bee hotels themselves, some of the design considerations, the different styles that they're out there, and based on what you want to do ultimately with your bee hotel, if you want to just have a nice diversity of individuals use them versus harvesting, there's lots of considerations and lots of different ways you could go about it. So to start off, there's essentially 3 different styles or designs of bee hotels. The first is the block type. You can either take a solid piece of wood like this one on the right, and you can use a drill to make holes of different sizes. In this one, these are very attractive. They're a little bit harder to clean though, compared to, for example, a stacked type of block design, which is in the middle. This is essentially a piece of wood that is several different pieces of wood with different holes drilled into it. These are easier to open, easier to clean. These have been popular in several studies, but what's interesting is Elsa just finished up some research from last year, and for some reason the bees in Raleigh and the wasps in Raleigh were not super big fans of this design for whatever reason. But other studies have shown really good success. So this is a good design to consider. Still have to figure out why the Raleigh bees and wasps weren't fans. Another type that's similar to the block type design that's more geared towards educational opportunities is essentially the observation hives. You can take a pane of plexiglass and essentially put it over the cavities and create a nice observation area to see the wasps and bees going in and out and making their provisions. There are a couple of hives, I think, at the Ecology farm and around the country. This is a really nice educational tool to kind of see the different ways wasps and bees are using their cavities. And it's important to keep them dark because the bees won't use them if you keep them open all the time. But it's nice to peek in every once in a while. And then lastly is the bundle type of bee hotel. Essentially, you can take lots of different materials. Either you can purchase them or you can harvest them from plants in your yard. Anything with a pithy stem essentially will work. You can take reeds, bamboo, and cardboard. We don't really recommend paper because it tends to be a little bit flimsy and doesn't hold up super well. Plastic straws, although they look really tempting, they seem like the right size and diameter, very easy, but in fact, they're not a good option. Bees will use them, but mold becomes an issue. They don't really breathe very well, and so you can have mortality associated with using plastic straws. So stay away from those. But you can use bamboo and reeds are very popular for a lot of the bees and wasps around here. Elsa's studies also showed the reeds were most popular, the ones that were the giant canes or the river canes, as well as blackberry, brambles were also very, very popular items for the bees in this area. So again, you can also use local materials. You can either keep the pith, the vascular tissue in the reeds, or you can remove it. Seratina, our small carpenter bees, needs that pith for the partitions, while Osmia prefers it to be open. The most important thing is to have one end that is closed. So either if you're harvesting reeds, cutting beyond a node so that you have a back, or putting your reeds in another bigger container, or like a giant reed that we see here in this picture, or maybe a PVC pipe, not only to provide some shelter from the weather, but also to provide that solid backing. And then having an open end the bees can actually use. And lastly, if you're planning to see who's actually using your nest, it's probably best to use reeds. Those are easier to split open so you can see pupae if you want to harvest them. Bamboo is a lot harder to split. Regarding the size of bee hotels, there are some really beautiful, elaborate, large bee hotels that are out there. There's actually a similar one like this in the Ralston Arboretum. The studies have shown that actually bigger is not necessarily better. Bees prefer smaller hotels. There's been several studies where the bees actually prefer hotels that have less than 100 holes when given an option. And we haven't really found any papers that cite this, but it's more common sense. We believe that bigger hotels will probably be bigger magnets for parasites and parasitoids. So we recommend using lots of smaller hotels and spacing them around your yard versus using a bigger one. For other non-traditional designs for making bee hotels, you can use different reeds from plants in your yard, especially perennial plants, or you can even just use the plants themselves. Just take the old growth and cut it off, essentially 8 to 24 inches above the ground. And bees will use that dead wood essentially to nest in the next year. There are some different types of plants that we recommend listed on the right. So we have our canes, we have mallow family, the hibiscus, we have sumac, the brambles, blackberry, raspberry, elder, goldenrod, and black-eyed Susans. Essentially a lot of different plants you can use, but the key is having something with a hollow or a pithy stem that our bees and wasps naturally would like to use. And lastly, if you want to make it a little bit more fun with your naturally harvested reeds in your yard, you can actually make these wattle fences. This is a picture from Chapel Hill, the North Carolina Botanical Garden, where they harvested lots of reeds and essentially made a nice little fence out of it. There's bees and wasps that have been seen using it. And what's nice about this is you don't necessarily have to worry about hygiene too much or maintenance. It'll break down naturally over time, over the next couple of years, and you can just compost it after that. Elsa's going to touch on the importance of hygiene with bee hotels that you want to maintain for longer than that period of time. And this is actually very important for the health of the residents in bee hotels. And wood piles have also been shown to be pretty popular with Osmia species. We've seen them using different types of wood there. So if you're going out to your wood pile for a fire, if you see some bees using it, maybe keep those around for a while so the bees can continue to use that type of wood that year. And so I'm going to pass it back off to Elsa to bring us home, thinking about more design considerations for the bee hotel.
All right, thanks, Meredith. Let me get my slides back up there. Oops, I think I'm making a mistake. Okay, getting there. Okay, can everybody see my screen again?
Looks good to me.
Great. Before I forge ahead, I also want to highlight a couple of great questions that came up in the chat box for anybody who's not attending to the chat box. One question was about paper straws. We mentioned that plastic straws have mold problems and aren't recommended. Paper straws don't have the mold problem, but because they're so thin, they're very susceptible to parasitic wasps that can just poke their little ovipositors right through that paper and parasitize the bees. So they're not very safe. So paper straws are recommended more as a liner for other materials. Like if you have one of those drilled wooden blocks that you can't take apart in stacks, you can insert paper straws inside those holes so that you can still, you know, swap out the straws every year or two to keep the overall hotel clean. The other question is, if you don't have a place to forage for your own stems and reeds, can you order them? You can. The source that I'm aware of is a company called Crown Bees. It's based in, I want to say, Oregon, somewhere out west, and they sell natural reeds as well as cardboard tubes and various other forms of bee hotels. So whenever I've bought nesting materials, it's been from them, but you might shop around. I'm sure there's other sources too. So onward then with design considerations. So this is now getting, these last few minutes, we'll get into some of the nitty gritty of actually constructing your bee hotel. One of the first considerations is the diameter of the holes that you're going to use. If you're just using natural nest materials, you'll probably get a smorgasbord, a range of sizes. If you're drilling your own holes, you have choices. And holes anywhere from 1 or 2 millimeters all the way up to 12 will be occupied by someone. As Meredith indicated, the size kind of dictates which species will use it. So if you're catering to a particular species like the blue orchard bee or the alfalfa leaf cutting bee, you'll want to use that specific diameter, which for orchard bees, 7.5 millimeters, alfalfa leaf cutting bees, 6 millimeters. That 0.5 millimeter there might seem super picky, but that actually matters. If bees end up using holes that are even a 0.5 millimeter too small relative to their preference, they'll produce overall fewer offspring and fewer females, which means that then the next generation has a lower reproductive capacity. If the hole is too big for that species preference, they're just less likely to use it in general. The length of the hole also matters, although there is less data on this. The studies that we have are really mainly in those 2 managed species, and for them, a length of 15 to 20 centimeters or 6 to 8 inches is recommended. We don't know if species would also use longer ones, but we know that it shouldn't be shorter than that because of this issue of putting the female brood in the back, and if they get too close to the front too quickly, they'll start producing males, and again, you have a skewed sex ratio in the next generation. The bees also need to be able to find your bee hotel in the first place, and then once they've found it, to identify their own personal nesting hole within it. And so some considerations for this are hole spacing. It seems like it's easier for bees to recognize their own hole if the holes are spaced about 2 centimeters apart, or about 3/4 of an inch. And you can achieve that spacing in 2 dimensions or in 3. So if you're drilling into the face of a block, you know, that's a 2-dimensional surface that the bees have to recognize, but you can keep those holes a couple centimeters apart. If you're bundling reeds together, you can't space them that far apart, but you can use a variety of sizes to make the different holes recognizable, or you can, as shown in these pictures, pull some of the reeds out, push others in, so that you get that spacing in the 3 dimensions instead of 2. But you don't want to, once nesting has started for the year, you don't want to change any of that arrangement, because then everyone will be super confused and not be able to recognize their own nest once, if that configuration changes while they're out foraging. Color is also relevant, and this is actually a way you can help bees find the nest in the first place. This picture here is from a study in blue orchard bees, which found that they were more likely to occupy nests that were in a blue shelter than in a red or yellow shelter. And bee eyes are just generally more sensitive to this blue-purple range of the color spectrum. Red doesn't really look like much to them. It may even just sort of look black to them. So making a blue shelter or painting the front of a nest with contrasting sort of blue and white patterns can also help them orient to the nest and locate their individual hole within it. You also want to have your hotel in some kind of shelter. This mainly protects against the elements, keeps the rain out, and also keeps things like woodpeckers out. They are definitely a threat to bee hotels made in soft materials or unprotected reeds. And you can just be creative with shelter construction. Some people use a PVC pipe. It's very utilitarian but effective. It is plastic, so it doesn't particularly breathe, but the fact that you're using natural materials inside of it means that it doesn't really promote mold problems on its own. You can also use a large diameter section of bamboo. You can build wooden boxes. You can just be creative. But you definitely want something keeping it safe from weather and woodpeckers. This is an example of ones in bamboo sections. And then as far as where to put your bee hotel, a lot of people will put them on fence posts or mount on the side of a building or a shed. There's not, again, a lot of hard data on what is really preferred, except they do tend to prefer sunny sites over shady sites. And the conventional wisdom is that they want that sun hitting the fronts of the nests in the morning, kind of gets them an early start for the day. They get out foraging, get a head start on the pollen. So try and have those entrances facing south or southeast toward morning sun. You generally want it 1 meter to a couple meters off the ground. That height may be just for our own human convenience of maintaining and observing them, but I definitely wouldn't put them right down on the ground or so low that the entrances are blocked by vegetation. And then you also want to make sure that you are thinking of the other resources bees need. Of course, they need a nest, but they also need the flowers to forage from. A lot of species won't go more than 100 or a couple hundred meters to forage. So you definitely want to know that you've got everything they need within a city block or 2 of the nest. All right, and now we arrive at issues of health and hygiene. We've already talked about the threat that woodpeckers pose, and the countermeasure for that is just to put it in some sort of protective housing. Pathogens and mold are also an issue that we've already acknowledged. You can combat those by using natural and breathable materials that prevent mold, and then by regular cleaning. And I'm going to come back on the next slide to how you actually clean a bee hotel. And then parasites are probably the biggest issue that, you know, even if bees are occupying your bee hotel, they may not have very many successful offspring if the parasite population builds up to a high level. And these include mites, parasitic wasps. There's a couple of parasitic wasps shown here. There's a pollen mite shown here, as well as cuckoo bees. And most of these organisms are going into the nest and eating the pollen that the mother bee collected and that her own larva was supposed to eat, but will starve to death if these other organisms come in here and eat it. Some of the parasitic wasps are actually eating the bee larva itself. So in general, we can combat parasite problems again with choice of materials. There is evidence that natural materials are safer than, for example, paper, which is much easier for a wasp to sort of poke through and lay an egg. You see this spiky little egg-laying ovipositor back here. Some of them can even penetrate through 3/4 of an inch of wood. So if you're using a relatively unprotected block, make sure that it's with holes drilled in it. Make sure those holes don't start within about 3/4 of an inch of the edge of the board. Size is also a consideration. Like Meredith said, we haven't found really strong studies that demonstrate an effect of bee hotel size on parasitism, but it's just sort of an opinion and observation of experts and people who have used these a lot, is that the larger the hotel, the more the parasite population builds up. So even though it's not super well documented, there's a lot of experience backing up this idea that smaller is better. And then regular cleaning is again important, especially to keep things like mites from building up in those nest tubes. So how do you clean a bee hotel? Because there's always someone in it. Even when you don't see adult bees actively foraging, that whole life cycle actually is occurring throughout the year. So you may have larvae or pupae inside even when you don't see adults coming and going. So when would you actually take it down and clean it without killing anyone? So you have to actually get them to move out before you can, you know, go and bleach the materials. So how would you do that? The recommended way is to use an emergence box. These wooden boxes here are examples. You could also go with something simpler like cardboard. It just needs to be some sort of opaque box that your bee hotel will fit inside. And it needs to have one little bee-sized exit hole. So I think in these pictures, like, looks like the exit hole is there, maybe there. So what will happen is at the end of the season, in the sort of late fall, you will take down your bee hotel that all of your bees and wasps have been nesting in all summer. You'll put it in this emergence box and you'll stick it somewhere cold and safe for the rest of the winter, like maybe in a shed or somewhere, somewhere cold but safe from like woodpeckers. And then in the spring, you'll set it back outside. And your bees will start to emerge and they'll see the light in this one little hole and they'll leave from it, but they're not attracted to come back in and continue using the bee hotel that's located within this emergence box. So by the end of that season, you would need to leave it out all summer if you have just a variety of bees and wasps in it. You don't know, like, everybody's going to be out by May. Well, not necessarily. It might be August, it might be September. So you would just leave this out all season and let everybody who's going to emerge and leave. Meanwhile, you will have put up a fresh, clean bee hotel. They'll move into that one. And at the end of the season, you can take your empty hotel out of the box and discard materials like reeds that, you know, just sort of compost those, and bleach things like, you know, the wooden blocks or the grooved boards. A 1 to 3 bleach solution with a 5-minute soak should do it. Sort of whatever you use to disinfect. I mean, I wouldn't go with like Lysol or anything like that, but bleach is pretty reliable. You can leave it dry out in the sun, and once it's aired out for a while, you know, it's ready to use again the next spring. It's also possible, if you're using something like the grooved board or the reeds, you can crack those open. If this is this works really only if you're targeting a single species. If you've got all like one size hole and you know that you only care about blue orchard bees, or you only care about alfalfa leaf cutting bees, and then everybody's kind of in synchrony, you can open up those nests in the fall and actually take out all your cocoons. This picture shows, whose are these? I think these are blue orchard bee cocoons. you can put those just loose in the emergence box or in the refrigerator and have them come out in the spring. But that works if you have sort of all one species in your hotel. Otherwise, like if you have other species that are not mason bees and leaf cutting bees, they may be overwintering as larvae or in other stages that don't tolerate having the nest opened. But this works for those particular species. All right, so you've got a bee hotel, you know who lives in it, so now what do you do with it? I'm sure you have a ton of ideas. I'll just throw out a few of them. To avoid future boredom, you can contribute to citizen science projects by observing your bee hotels and reporting your findings. There's a project based in Florida that collects information from bee hoteliers worldwide. It's called the Native Buzz, so that's one to look for. You might just sit back and enjoy enhanced pollination in your garden or in your fruit trees. You might tinker with designs. We've said a few times that a lot of the recommendations that are available are not always based on hard data. They're based on, observations, conventional wisdom. There's plenty of room to tinker with the sizes, the dimensions, see what the bees like, see what produces a good batch of offspring for the next year, see what looks cool. And then you can also, in some cases, like for orchard bees and leaf cutting bees, there are some programs that will buy back your pupae if you have extra ones, if you actually open up your nest and take out the pupae at the end of the season. There are some businesses that will buy them back for you. I know Crown Bees is one of those. Again, there may be others. And of course, you can always keep learning. And I'm going to suggest 3 books, Attracting Native Pollinators and Managing Alternative Pollinators. This second one, Managing Alternative Pollinators especially, it's actually geared more toward commercial bee operations, but it has a wealth of information about sort of health, hygiene, and maintenance of bee nesting blocks that would be relevant for anybody. And a sort of broader background on wild bees. Attracting Native Pollinators and The Bees in Your Backyard are both beautiful books with a wealth of background information. And with that, that covers everything that we wanted to specifically talk about. So I hope there's time to still open it up for some questions.
Yes, and there's a question in the chat about how do you recommend to control ants going into the bee hotel?
Yeah, so I don't have a great recommendation for that. I will say that of the ones that we put out around Raleigh last year, there was only one that had ants actually nesting in it. And it wasn't clear to us that ants had actually raided any of the others either. Definitely parasitic wasps were the bigger deal. That resulted in more bee larvae not becoming bees. I think it would maybe be a bigger threat when you've got bees stored, like if you take down the hotel in the fall and stick it in an emergence box. And there I would tend to try and put it on a tray that I've like put a rim of Vaseline around or something so that ants can't actually walk into the area where you're storing them. I don't know, Meredith, if you've got any other suggestions on ant control.
That was my thought, was Vaseline, either on, if they're going after the poles themselves when they're active, maybe just putting some Vaseline on that. But honestly, that's kind of where my thoughts went too, was just trying to create a physical barrier for the ants to not be able to get to the hotels.
Yeah. I think there was a question too in the chat, do these attract boring bees? I think maybe that question is referring to whether bee hotels will attract carpenter bees, perhaps in hopes that they'll nest in the bee hotel and not in your own wooden structure that you want to protect. I suspect not. Carpenter bees will occupy large holes in these, but I don't think they're ever big enough. Like carpenter bees, if you take an x-ray of a board that they've occupied, that nest will go on for many feet, and they continue reusing it and remodeling it year after year. So I suspect it would be difficult to provide enough alternative material for them to attract them away from some other structure that you want to protect. We've actually got a study ongoing right now. I want to say the person who asked the question might be helping us out with that study. But we're trying to identify what materials they prefer to drill in versus what ones they really hate, in hopes that, you know, we can adjust our construction practices to prevent them or provide, you know, preferred woods elsewhere away from the structures we want to protect. But that's all still speculative. Oh, somebody said carpenter bees did bore into their bee hotel. Cool. I see another question about allergies. It's not necessarily true that allergy to one kind of bee sting guarantees allergy to another. Of course, if your allergy is severe, that still feels like a very risky thing to try and find out. But if the allergy is not life-threatening, I would say give it a try. Most of the bees that will occupy bee hotels are very mild-mannered. Like you have to try hard to get them to sting you in the first place. Like you would have to pinch them, or like pretty much you would have to pinch them, or accidentally. It's like sometimes if you're among flowers, you'll get one like caught in your clothes or something, and then you might get stung. But just watching them around their nest entrance, they're very unlikely to sting. And an allergy to honeybees doesn't necessarily mean that you would have an allergy to these other species.
Right. And also the same with the wasps. Again, like the wasps that are going to be using the bee hotels are really mild mannered as well. So just being mindful, I guess, when you're around the hotel, if they're foraging, really the only time they would sting you is if you're going to pick them up accidentally or something like that. But they're also very mild mannered too.
We've got a question: do all bees die after stinging like honeybees? That's a great question. The answer is no. Only honeybees and their very close relatives in the genus Apis will die after stinging. They have a barbed sting that stays in your skin after they've stung you. And therefore, when the bee flies off, the sting stays behind and rips out the whole digestive tract. So that bee won't die immediately, but it is doomed because it can no longer eat and digest. But other bees don't have that barbed sting. Nothing gets torn out of their body after they sting you, and so they can go on and, you know, continue a normal life afterward. There's so many questions. I have honeybees. How far should I place the bee hotels from the hive? Great question. I don't know a specific number. I would just be inclined to kind of observe and stick the bee hotel in a place that has a relatively low level of honeybee activity. It may be that once they're foraging, they're going for different flowers. They're certainly going to be nesting in different places. So all I could say is, you know, I just kind of see what feels right. I wouldn't put them right on top of each other, just to avoid sort of traffic jams. But, you know, like on the other side of the yard kind of thing would probably be fine.
And there are definitely some flowers that our native bees are going to go after versus the honeybees. So it's, you know, like the squash bees in particular, I think, as well as the tomatoes, bumblebees are going to be visiting those a lot, and being able to pollinate those versus honeybees, which can't actually pollinate tomatoes.
We've got a question about timing. When creating a varied population hotel, when should they be put out and taken down? If you're not going after a specific species like blue orchard bees, then you've got a lot of flexibility in when you would put it up. Certainly if you want the maximum diversity to be able to access it, I would put it out in like February, or sort of like right before bees really start flying for the spring. And then I usually see activity and then I would take it down like after first frost. But really, you could, if you're not going for a specific species, you could put it up anytime and take it down after first frost. Is it true that carpenter bees will not bore through painted surfaces? That is unfortunately not true. It might slow them down a little bit, but once that paint starts to weather, or if it's not very thick, they'll go right through it. So it might buy you a little bit of time, but it's definitely not going to solve the whole problem.
So I'm wondering, Elsa, maybe if we do one more question now, and then if you guys are willing to hang out for a little while, Matt, Mike, and I have a few things to share, and then we can come back to some questions at the end.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Okay. All right. So maybe if we take the question about how to encourage ground nesting bees.
Okay. That is a great question, and it's one that doesn't have a lot of answers currently. Their habits are a little harder to study. So it seems like, sort of based on anecdotal reports and some research, They seem to prefer areas that have bare ground over anything with like plants, or certainly turf or mulch can be deterrents. So they need access to the soil. It seems like south-facing slopes or flat can either of those can work. And in some cases, it seems like there's one big species, one of the sweat bees, that really likes sort of a river stone cobble as opposed to a mulch over their bare soil. But again, there's a lot of room just for sort of observation and tinkering, because there aren't any really hard and fast, well-documented rules yet about what will attract ground nesting bees.
All right, thanks. So the books you mentioned, especially the one that's attracting native pollinators, does that include some more detail about all these different types of bees and how to attract them?
Yeah, I'll have to look, sorry, can't complete a sentence. I'll have to look back at that book and see what it has to say about ground nesting bees. I think it's not gonna have much specific to offer on them either. There's one exception, like the alkali bees that are actually managed commercially out west as pollinators. There's a very specific protocol for like how to develop a soil situation that's attractive to them, that has like the right amount of salt and the right amount of moisture. But that's like the one case where you're going to find, and it doesn't even apply to our part of the country, where you're going to find like specific instructions for cultivating a ground nesting bee.
All right, thank you. So like I said, Elsa and Meredith will stay with us, and we have so many wonderful questions. We want to make sure we have time to address them all, but you know, we might run a little bit over our time, but we do also want to share with you a couple of other things today, some BOLOs and our weed and plant of the month. So, you know, first say just thank you so much, both to Elsa and Meredith, for joining us today and the amazing information they've shared. They are going to share the slides, so that'll be something that goes in the follow-up email. And also, I did want to mention there was a couple of questions in the chat about how to save the chat, if you want to save the chat, because we have been putting a lot of links in there. So there's a couple of different things you can do. You can just right-click. You can just put your mouse or put your cursor on the chat and tap it, or right-click, and it will let you select all. So you can just do an old-fashioned copy and paste like that. Down at the bottom of the chat box, there's 3 little dots. And if you click on that, the first option is Save Chat. So that'll let you save the chat. And when you save it, it'll automatically put it somewhere in your files, and then it'll give you the option to see where it saved it to. And if you just want certain things out of the chat, and you have a mouse particularly, or if you're on an iPad, it might be a little more tricky on a smartphone, but you can just select, like take your mouse and select the section of the chat you want to copy, and then just copy and paste it to a Word document or somewhere where you want to save it. But everything that has been shared, all of the links will go out in our follow-up email, and that goes out to the EMG email list. So if you're not subscribed to that list, we will also send it to all of our agents and ask them to forward it to you, and that will include a link on how to subscribe to it. But let me I'll put the link in the chat right now again too. So hopefully you'll be able to either get it directly from the EMG list or forwarded from your agent. And we can also post it on NCSU Garden on the statewide site. So you can come back and then learn more and investigate some of the resources that we've been sharing. All right, so I'm going to ask Matt to share our closing slide set.
Sure thing. All right. Let's see. Can you see that?
Yes.
Let me make you the host, or let you control it. Let me.
Okay. We are trying something a little bit new this month, so we have put together a combined slide set, and we're going to see how it works to hand off the ability to advance slides. So I'm trying to advance the slide now. Okay. All right, we went ahead. So we're going to start off with a new feature, which we debuted last month, but in case you weren't with us last month, just wanted to mention this is, we're going to have every month a plant of the month and a weed of the month.
Oh, Charlotte, was this the wrong one?
No, this is it.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, no, I included this slide, so just to introduce it again. So we'll go ahead and jump in, and our plant of the month, and with our plant of the month features, because we've had a lot of requests for people wanting to learn more about native plants, and particularly native plants that are good for birds and bees. So that's what we're focusing on with our plant of the month each month, something that is a good native plant for birds and bees that maybe is not the most common native plants that are used in the landscape. So trying to expand your knowledge of these plants, but there are things that should be commercially available, but you might have to go to a specialty nursery or ask a local nursery to order them. So our plant of the month this month is Serviceberry, which is Amelanchier arborea. It is native to all of the eastern United States, and in North Carolina it can be found everywhere except for our coastal counties, so right out on the coast. But it can be grown there still if you put it in the right spot. It is in the rose family like many of our edible fruits, so it does have an edible fruit that ripen in May and June, which is one of the earliest ripening of our native fruiting plants. So that's a good food source for songbirds. Also, a lot of mammals will feed on it. It is pretty tasty, and you can eat them yourselves if you can get them before the birds, which is definitely a struggle. So I would plant it just keeping in mind that the birds are most likely, let the birds enjoy it. It is quite an adaptable small tree, and it will grow in sun or shade. It prefers part shade, particularly some afternoon shade, and it'll tolerate moist or dry conditions, but it prefers kind of that woodland soil, that moist, well-drained, but acidic soil. Okay, I think just trying to advance it. I think there's a little bit of a lag. Maybe, yeah, okay. I did want to mention, as far as the fruits go, it can get one of these funky looking rust diseases, cedar quince rust. And there has been a little bit of interest in Serviceberry for commercial production, but this is really limited. And you might see this, and it's just one of those things like apple cedar rust. The red cedar is the alternate host, so if you have cedar trees close by, you're going to more likely see this on your Serviceberry trees. And it's not really something that we actively try to control. By the time you see these symptoms going on, it's too late to control anything anyway. But you might get some questions about this or see this on Serviceberry trees that you plant. Let's see if we can get it to, there we go. And as a landscape tree, it is quite attractive. I think one challenge for it ever catching on as a popular tree is it blooms at the same time as dogwoods, you know, and everybody loves dogwoods. But it is blooming right now. It does have these small white flowers. It has lots of them. And it is quite showy when it's in bloom. It only blooms for a couple of weeks, like many of our spring bloomers. It is a deciduous, large shrub or small tree. It most often grows with multiple stems and can get to be about 15 to 25 feet tall. And as an understory tree, it does provide wonderful nesting habitat. Most of our birds like to nest from 5 to 15 feet above the ground. So they're not nesting up in the tall canopy trees. It's these understory trees that are wonderful nesting habitat. And also those blooms are a good early nectar source for pollinators, variety of pollinators. Oops. And it is a host plant for a couple of different types of butterflies. The red-spotted purple, the caterpillars you can see have that self-defense of looking like bird droppings, because in the hopes that other birds don't want to eat bird droppings. You can see that that's what they've taken on that appearance. And this is red-spotted purple in the picture. Also Viceroy, which is the caterpillar that looks like a monarch. I mean, the butterfly, it looks similar to a monarch, and the caterpillars look similar here. They will use the leaves as a host for their larvae. And the leaves also are attractive in fall color. They can look really nice. In good years, they can get this rusty red colors. They some years maybe more yellow, more apricot colored. And like a lot of things in the rose family, you know, they can get some leaf spot diseases and things like that. So this is a wonderful tree to use at the edge of the woods in a naturalized situation and to create habitat. But just, you know, keep in mind the leaves can get a few leaf spot diseases and things. And then we'll talk about our weed of the month. This month, our weed of the month is woolly mullein for Bascom Thapsus. And it is a weed that can be found all throughout North Carolina, especially in poor areas, poor soils, disturbed areas, roadsides. Not often a lawn weed because it doesn't establish well in lawns that are mowed frequently, but anywhere that's just kind of not mown very often, in your landscape beds, especially if your mulch is really thin, you might get some of this coming up. And it has these really large leaves. They're covered in this very fine hairs, very downy hairs. It gives it that silver look, and it looks like lamb's ear, but the leaves are even bigger. It is a biennial, so it forms these basal rosettes of foliage. So the leaves are all in this, just close to the ground there. And in summer, it has these spikes of yellow flowers. So really tall spikes, you know, the spike can be 4 feet tall or more. I've seen them 6 feet or more. And these little yellow flowers line the spike. And, you know, so it can be a little bit attractive, but most people do consider it a weed. But the reason we have it as our weed of the month, for this month particularly, is that we currently have a worldwide toilet paper crisis. And this is one of the plants that has been suggested by many as a good toilet paper substitute because of those nice downy leaves. So this is not research-based information. I will put that out there as a disclaimer. But you can see other things being suggested here, lamb's ear, mallow. So if it really gets desperate, turn to your weeds. And then just a few tips on controlling or managing mullein. If you're interested in controlling it, keep in mind it is a biennial. So the right strategy for controlling a weed really goes back to understanding its life cycle. So as a biennial, it takes 2 years to complete that life cycle, and it's spreading by seed. So the first year it germinates, typically in the summer, so it's coming up much earlier than our cool season annuals. Which we also see a lot of this time of year. And it just grows that foliage, summer, fall, winter, and then it'll usually bloom in the spring and summer. And once the bloom is finished, it makes thousands and thousands of seeds. There have been several studies, and one of the lower counts that has been documented was an average of 100,000 seeds per plant. So that's actually per bloom spike, because each plant typically makes 1 bloom spike. So other studies found 200,000 seed from 1 bloom spike. So you can imagine you could have 1 mullein and you could leave that seed spike to mature, and you could have lots and lots and lots of seeds coming up throughout your garden. So the easiest method to control it is, if you want to see it bloom, just cut the bloom spike off after it's finished blooming before those seeds start ripening. The problem, usually once it starts blooming, if you cut the spike off, it won't make more spikes, but you would want to keep an eye out potentially for maybe some little additional spikes forming. So that's a really easy control. You can keep your mulch layer nice and even and thick to prevent germination. And you can pull them up, of course, when they're young. When they're small, that's, you know, in the summer and fall after they've just come up, that's going to be the best time. Because like many biennials, they do have a taproot, so you want to get the whole taproot out. And then if there is a situation that you do need to spray it, any of the non-selective herbicides or broadleaf herbicides should be effective, especially when it's young. But this weed particularly is one that is easy to manage mechanically or culturally, so that might not be necessary. So I encourage you to scout around your home and your property for woolly mullein in case you do run into a toilet paper shortage, or you just want to observe a really interesting weed that we have throughout North Carolina. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt and Mike, who are going to share with us some BOLOs.
Can you go back on the slides, please? I have to
Oh,
remove
did I
control.
advance it?
Oh, here we go. Let me see. Okay. Okay, you didn't see that. Nobody saw that. All right, let's see. All right. Well, I'm gonna, since we're going a little over time, I'm gonna try and go through this a little bit quicker. But there are a bunch of things going on, and actually, it's a little unpredictable this year because things have been pretty warm, and it's been a very mild winter. So things I would expect to be a little later are happening a little earlier. So first, boxwood leaf miners are emerging. I actually saw them here in Wake County emerging the other day. And typically, I looked at the last couple years, it's been around April, middle of April. So be on the lookout for them. This is a time when contact chemical sprays can help treat for the adults. Once the adults lay eggs in the leaves and the larvae start to mine inside them, they're basically, the only control is systemic insecticides. So right now, look for little swarming orange flies around your boxwoods. This usually coincides with the new growth, so you can usually time it every year when your boxwoods start to put out that new growth. As Elsa and Meredith talked about, nesting is beginning, and a lot of wasps and bees. So the social wasps, like the hornets, the yellow jackets, and the paper wasps, are out and about. They're starting to collect material to make their first few cells, so they can lay the eggs and start raising workers to help build the colony more. And this, of course, also includes the carpenter bees that was mentioned in the talk. Carpenter bees, the ones that bore into wood, are going to be present right now. First come out the males, as Elsa Meredith mentioned. The males are laid out in the front so that they emerge first. They will buzz around, they'll stare you down, they'll try and scare you away from potential nest sites because they think you're a competitor. And you can tell the males because the males have these yellow faces. And they are harmless. Males cannot sting because they have no egg laying device, which is actually what the stinger is modified from. And carpenter bees can be told from bumblebees in that they have a shiny black abdomen, a very big round head, and otherwise they're about similar size, typically bigger though than most of the bumblebees that we get around here. More bees, of course. Ground nesting bees are becoming more active. Again, like Elsa and Meredith said, these prefer a little bit more open areas. So again, the best way to encourage your ground nesting bees is to kill your grass, or at least make sure it's patchy. So they like these areas that have a little bit of vegetation, but lots of soil exposed so that they can find their nests, dig in the ground, and create their nests for their young. And with this, there are also, of course, lots of pollinators out and about in general anyway. So here's a honeybee on a mahonia, but basically because all the flowers have started, you're going to see things being attracted to these plants. And in a non-bee related bolo, Hoplea beetles. These are sometimes called monkey beetles, and they will begin emerging. I actually received an email image to identify this. These beetles are harmless. They really don't harm plants. Their larvae live in the soil, feed on a little bit of roots of plants, but are generally not an issue. But at this time of year, we do sometimes have people sending in images, calling us up about these mass emergences of these small black beetles. The best way to identify these beetles is that, it's hard to see here under this menu bar, but their hind claws, they really only have one claw on their hind leg, and it's very large. Their hind legs are also much more enlarged than the others, and they often have these white or pale, scaly or hairy appearance on their black body. Lastly, there are going to be a lot of things emerging from eggs. So Mantises will start hatching from the ootheca. These are ones that are kind of just popping out. You can see they're weird little alien looking things. And as they start to dry out and kind of emerge and form, they're going to look like little tiny mantises, of course. And then the bugs. So the leaf-footed bugs and assassin bug nymphs are going to be hatching from their eggs. You're going to start to see these little red and black nymphs all around. Leaf-footed bugs are told by their much larger hind legs than their front legs. Typically, they're more red, whereas the more common wheel bugs that may be confused, which are assassin bugs and are predators, are going to be black with the yellow tip of their antennae, and they have much heavier front legs than their hind legs. All right, I think that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Before that, Matt, you got a couple questions in the chat there.
Sure, I couldn't see the chat. Let me take a look at the chat. Okay, so what we got? Are ambrosia beetles more prevalent? More prevalent this year? Ambrosia beetles are everywhere, all the time. Basically, so as long as it's warm out, they're going to be out looking for plants to colonize. Now, I should note, this is what I tell everybody, is that ambrosia beetles are signs of sick or stressed plants. They are not going to attack healthy and happy plants. So they are out in the environment. They are looking for dead or dying material. Plants are very good at sending out chemicals that when they're stressed that we can't see, and so a plant can be stressed and be green. So just be aware that if you see ambrosia beetles attacking plants, that means that there's some underlying issue going on there. It could be winter damage, it could be a disease, root disease, it could be something else, but definitely let us know, or if you have questions about what's specifically affecting that plant, we can try and figure it out, but know that they don't attack healthy plants. Except for one exception is going to be the red bay ambrosia beetle, which will attack bay laurels and is very difficult to prevent. And southern pine beetles attacking pines are very rare around. And then last one, how large is the Hoplea beetle body? So it's about 1/3 of an inch long. They are not huge beetles, but they're not tiny beetles. So think about like a little bit smaller than an average Japanese beetle. Okay, any other questions? Oh, and one thing I did want to mention, there was a question in the chat before about, during the bee session, about wasps who were purchased for horse farm for fly control. Those parasitoids are only specific to flies and will not attack bees or bee nests. So usually when parasitoids are sold, they're fairly specific to what needs to be controlled. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Mike. Oh, sorry, there's one more too. That's all right. But who knows what else is going to be coming out because of the weird weather and the warm weather. Tent caterpillars, you may be on the lookout for them because it is a warmer season. They may be a little earlier than usual. So if you see these large hairy caterpillars with the white stripe down the back, you know you have eastern tent caterpillars. But I think all bets are off now with BOLOs, I feel like. So let us know if you see anything weird and we'll try and help you identify them.
It says here that I have control of Matt's presentation. And we'll try and go into our disease BOLOs. Be on the lookout for these in the next month or so on our woody ornamentals. Of course, as the showy bracts of the dogwood start expanding, we will probably see spot anthracnose. This is not to be confused with dogwood anthracnose, a disease, much more serious disease and only found in the mountains, but the cosmetic disease of spot anthracnose will vary in its severity depending on the weather conditions each spring. So it's always an interesting thing to see how much we'll have. We'll continue to see Entomosporium leaf spot on Indian hawthorn and any photinia that may still be in the landscape. It's characterized by the bright, or actually dark kind of reddish spots with gray blister-like centers. The Gymnosporangium rust, and I'll say something about that in a moment as it relates to Amelanchier, but at this time of year, we won't see the symptoms on the rosaceous host. We'll see them on the junipers. The earliest one would be the quince rust on the juniper branches, which down in the, is my cursor visible here?
Yep, you're good.
Just a slight swelling there, but does produce that gelatinous orange set of telia versus the cedar apple rust, which comes on the large gall. And Exobasidium leaf gall on camellia, you can see in the lower left there, which we'll also start to be able to see as the new growth comes on. Now, this is another symptom that you may see on the Amelanchier. I noticed that Charlotte had the picture of the esia on the fruit, but you can also get stem swellings on this. So this time of year, you might be seeing this particular symptom here of last year's stem infections and the remnants of the esia there. I saw a question in the chat whether there were any resistant varieties, and as far as I know, there are not. And it also may depend on what particular rust you're dealing with. I tried to identify the one we had on campus here and really couldn't tell for sure. The bad thing about the cedar quince rust, which does get on Amelanchier, is that apparently, at least in Sinclair and Lyon's book, that doesn't have the same distance limitation that cedar apple rust does. So while you're trying to put that separation between your junipers and your apple trees to help reduce cedar apple rust, that may not be an effective strategy for cedar quince rust. So this is a really difficult situation, I would say, as far as the Amelanchier in areas where you're seeing the disease. Continuing with our woody ornamentals, of course, Phytophthora and Armillaria root rot could show up any time of year. There's a photograph there of arborvitae with one of them being affected by, in that case, Armillaria root rot, and you wouldn't know until you peeled away the bark at the base of the main stem there, as you can see in the lower right, and see the white mycelial mat there of the Armillaria. Of course, that's the kind of sample you don't want to take if you think the tree can still be salvaged. While I'm on the topic of sampling, though, we probably should mention that the clinic, the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic, is closed. We are only accepting image samples, digital image samples at this time, but those can be submitted through our database as usual. Boxwood, Matt mentioned the boxwood leaf miner. Boxwood blight, of course, we always want to be on the lookout for. Remember again, the three symptoms there are brown leaf spots, dark streaks on the green stems, and defoliation. If you see any two of those three, then you've probably got boxwood blight. Shot hole on cherry laurel looks like insect feeding, but is in fact a response of the plant to an infection by a fungus or bacterium, and the hole drops out. The spot drops out, forming a hole. And finally, just to mention that root knot nematode can be there lurking in the soil, debilitating the plants, especially boxwood and gardenia, but other plants in the landscape as well. I see a question in the chat box. Just planted serviceberry tree last fall. Is that stem swelling something to look for? Well, if it were infected last spring, then yes, you may have it, but it won't reinfect serviceberry again. This is one of those rusts that has to go back and forth between juniper and then the rosaceous alternate host. So what you'll be looking for will be the swellings on this year's growth coming later on in another couple of months' time. And then, of course, those dramatic papery spore-filled fruiting bodies on the actual fruit of the shrub. Very quickly, we don't have much in the vegetable garden yet, but Pythium root rot and damping off will be things to be on the lookout for, as well as overzealous gardeners putting too much fertilization on and causing problems that way. In the fruit, we may see some problems on peaches, such as peach leaf curl, Tophrina. You can see that on the left there. And then as far as fire blight, we could be seeing that on pear, and you can see the photograph there on the lower part of the slide. But keep in mind that peach does not get fire blight. It may be reported, but really it's not something that gets on peach. You do want to be aware, though, that there is a blossom and twig blight phase of the brown rot fungus, the one that causes the fruits to turn mushy and brown and full of spores and become mummies later in the year. There's an early stage of that disease that you want to be on the lookout for. Let's see a few more questions in the chat. Is there a cure for armillaria root rot? No, there is not. If you do have that diagnosed, you want to remove the tree, as many of the large roots as you can, and don't plant another woody shrub or tree in that spot for, I would say, at least 2 years, just so it'll die out. How to treat boxwood blight. That is a long conversation, a lot of different cultural and occasionally chemical methods you want to use. At this point, I would just refer people to the Virginia Boxwood Blight Task Force website for some good information. They've got some best management practice documents for different situations, for historic gardens, for nurseries, for homeowners, and so on. I have black swellings on my ornamental apricot. What is it? It could be something called black knot. I'm not usually familiar on apricot, usually more on plum. But if you want to send a picture to us through the database, we can take a look at that. Maybe figure it out.
It does attack it. I've seen that before on the ornamental apricots, Prunus mume.
Oh, you have? I have not seen black knot on there, but that's interesting to know. And thank you for putting the link in there, Charlotte. So just to finish off our disease bolos for the coming month, several things that you can see in the flower bed this month. I decided to highlight the other kinds of rust, not the Gymnosporangiums that will alternate between hosts as we talked about before, but we have the possibility of seeing some high hawk rust and the small pustules there on the underside of the leaf, as you see on the left. And also oxalis, if anyone happens to be growing that as an ornamental, you could be seeing rust on that, the leaves of that as well. Volutella blight on Pachysandra, we had a sample come in. I don't remember now if this is this month or in February now, but concerned that it might have been boxwood blight because it does affect Pachysandra, but only if it's really in a planting with infected boxwoods. And it turned out that that particular case from that nursery was Volutella blight, which we probably just would call leaf and stem blight because the fungus name has changed. It's now Coccinonetria pachysandricola, if you like to say things like that. The symptoms fairly dramatic, blotching there on the leaves, sometimes with a sort of a concentric pattern. In turf, and the usual disclaimer that I'm not a turf pathologist, but as things start warming up, especially if we have a wet spring, I'm told that we could be seeing fairy ring and any kind of turf. See that in the lower left there? That's just one type of manifestation where you get the green ring and the more normal colored turf on the inside and the outside of it. That ring may also be consisting of dead turf, and it may even have some mushrooms or puffballs in it at some point. On the cool season grasses, especially tall fescue, you may occasionally see this time of year a disease called yellow patch, which is pictured in the center there, with those yellowish, in some cases, ring-looking spots. And on the warm season grasses, which are going to be under stress still because of our cooler temperatures that haven't quite warmed up completely, you could be seeing a disease called large patch, which is caused by a fungus somewhat related to the yellow patch fungus, and also to the brown patch fungus, which we won't see yet until the weather warms up and considerably, and we'll get it on our fescues. And finally, the Bermuda grass, the zoysia, as they are breaking dormancy, you may get some spring dead spot where a fungal infection from last year caused that particular spot of turf to be susceptible to cold injury and die out. Let's see if some in the chat here. Okay, where to send that? I'm new to the service. Charlotte has has put that in. Yep, the long URL is there. The short one is www.ncsu.edu/PDIC. I'll type that one in. And you can read our instructions there on how to do it and how to log into the database and so forth. With that, I guess, Matt, you're the one who can take the control back.
Thank you, and I will do that. All right. Well, Charlotte.
All right. Well, we're happy. Yeah, we're happy to hang out and continue answering questions. We certainly appreciate everyone joining us today, and especially our guest speakers, Elsa and Meredith. I would just say continue to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll continue to answer them as long as folks are interested in staying today. And thank you all, and wish you all a really great day, a great week, and just reinforce everybody to stay healthy and follow social distance practicing. And we really hope to all be able to be together again next month when we have Plants and Pests and Pathogens. Our feature will be Matt and Mike will give us some more in-depth information about current insects and diseases. That will be on the 28th, April 28th. We are the 4th Tuesday of each month. And I will add to the chat the links where you can find our recordings and find our playlist on YouTube. I will say it may take a little longer than usual to get the recording posted. I have noticed with Zoom, it's taking them longer to process those recordings than usual, because I imagine there's a lot of things out there being recorded. So any other questions, if you want to drop them in the chat or you want to unmute your mic and ask, you're welcome to do that. So we had one come in, I think Elsa and Meredith, this is for you guys, and it was a question about brown bags. Or Matt, you might know too, would brown bags keep carpenter bees away? I think where it was posted earlier, it said it's supposed to look like a wasp nest, and that could deter carpenter bees. Do you guys know if there's any truth to that?
I've also heard that. I've never seen any evidence one way or the other. So it's one of those kind of, as far as I know, things that kind of falls in the category of urban legend. Can't hurt to try it, but wouldn't count on it. I will also say that I am skeptical of the paper wasp as a deterrent to carpenter bees idea, just anecdotally based on my own yard. I see them nesting like right next to each other, sort of in the steps of my deck and in the rafters of my shed. So I suspect that they wouldn't really repel each other very much, but try it, keep track, like it won't hurt anything, and then maybe we'll know a little better.
Very true, and I'll second that. We have lots of wasps around our property, and we also have lots of carpenter bees. They seem to be cohabitating quite well together, close together.
Another one of the questions that we didn't get to earlier was, do you still recommend using the fluorescent yellow and blue paint to attract bees, painted on the reeds and on the bee hotel itself? And that's another thing that's based kind of on anecdotal evidence, but does seem to work. In the main part of the webinar, we talked about using like blue and black patterns to attract the bees or to help them recognize their own nests. And there are also sort of fluorescent yellow and white paints that are also highly visible to bees. So any of those are also fine to use as potential attractants, and then to sort of create a pattern across the front of the bee hotel that will help them recognize individual pulls.
Also a question that we didn't get to about squirrels pulling reeds out of hotels. I'm not really sure how we can discourage squirrels from doing that.
Yeah, I think you could seasonally, like there is a possibility to wrap your hotel sort of in hardware cloth in the off season, But at that point, you could also just take it down and protect it in a shed or something. It's not recommended to have hardware cloth around it while bees are actively flying in and out, because they'll beat up their wings on it. So I agree, that is a tough one.
Also
You
could
might
probably help with,
try like anything
woodpeckers.
that you use to try and deter squirrels from a bird feeder. You could try using those same deterrents to, like, you know, if your bee hotel is on a post, putting some sort of deflector on it. But I would just recommend tinkering.
Yeah, I think hardware cloth is also supposed to help with woodpeckers too. So yeah, lots of areas to experiment, I think.
Yep.
I saw, oh, here's another one just popped in. Actually, I'll go back. There was one about plant sales. So a little bit different topic about plant sales and how we should handle those, because there are many of our Master Gardener volunteers had plant sales scheduled, and Extension has canceled all face-to-face activities for the next 60 days. That was announced just this past weekend. So any plant sales that are scheduled should, if they have not already been canceled, they should be canceled. Anything that would bring people together face to face. So that is a discussion right now, just with agents right now. We're talking about what are you thinking about with plant sales, but we are going to schedule an online discussion potentially for Friday morning, just for all of us to get together, agents and volunteers, and talk about plant sales and ideas. But I would say just keep an eye on that, the email, that it will be sent out to the NC-EMGV email list, and then it'll be sent out to agents as well. I'm just trying to confirm a couple of other things before announcing the time and date for that online discussion, as well as other topics like how to get volunteer hours and maintaining plants and things like that. So yes, we will be working together to identify strategies and to share resources and share ideas. But there was a question about deterrence or control for carpenter bees. It's a popular question to our phone line, and maybe a future topic. Okay, a suggestion is a future topic for plants, pests, and pathogens. And again, Matt or Elsa and Meredith, if you guys have any tips for carpenter bee control and deterrence, that is definitely always a popular, hot question this time of year.
Well, hopefully soon, Elsa will know what the best materials are to deter them.
Yeah.
You know, if I was asked that question, I'd say there's very little that can be done if you have wooden structures. Chemical controls are really difficult. You can try to plug up holes, but they'll just make new ones. They'll bore right out. I'm sure Elsa has some other tips, but there's no good answer, honestly.
I agree. I wish I had some good tips, but I really don't have anything that's evidence-based at this point. We're starting, we have some ongoing projects and are starting some coming up to try and get at some answers. Right now, most of the existing recommendations, like I did a review of sort of all the extension documents in the Southeast, and they tend to say either like, well, it's kind of hopeless, or use treated lumber, but it's not 100%. And eventually once it weathers, they will drill into that. Use paint, but again, they will drill into that at some point as well. It might just slow them down a little bit. There are a variety of things you can buy online that I've not found any evidence one way or the other, whether they work. Carpenter bee traps, those jars that have sort of a, you know, an entrance that looks like a carpenter bee nest entrance into the wood, and then it goes into a jar and they get stuck in there. Those will attract and trap bees, but it's unclear that they get enough of the population to actually make a dent in the drilling activity in the long run. They might be part of an effective combination of things, like in combination with hole plugging and insecticide and so forth. But it's really, there aren't very good, clear recommendations that anybody would sort of guarantee at this point. And I am actually going to have to excuse myself. I've got a noon meeting I need to hop over to. Fortunately, with Zoom, there's no commute time. But anyway, thanks for having us, and thanks for all of the great questions. And Charlotte, Meredith, and I will be in touch after to share slides and resources and all of that.
Yes, thank you, everybody, for the great opportunity.
Yeah, thanks,
Yes.
Elsa and Meredith. That was great.
All right.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. This is a record total for attendance today. So this was another silver lining of the current situation is people have time to tune in.
Yeah, I'll have to head out too now to get lunch before 12:30 meeting. So yeah, fix it
All
for
right.
the kids too.
Yep,
Very
I'm gonna
good.
head out too. Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah. All right. See you later. Talk to you later.
Everyone, be well.
I'll talk to you by email, Charlotte and Mike. We'll just discuss some things. And yeah. Okay. Until then.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.